Geopolitical developments have occurred relentlessly over the past 6 months. At the top of the docket, of course, is Ukraine, and we will get to the most recent update in that situation, as there have been a lot of developments since we last discussed it, but we'll start with the geopolitical developments going on elsewhere in the world, many of which have been overlooked with the world's focus fixing on Ukraine. Let me also mention that since we're doing the update at the end of the month as opposed to the beginning, you'll notice that the map is dated as of the 30th of June. We'll start with the recent border treaty signed by Canada and Denmark. Back in 1973, a treaty had been signed between the two countries, delineating the border between the Canadian Northern Territories, with this area now being a part of the Nunavut Territory, and the Danish county of Greenland, now the Danish autonomous country of Greenland. This agreement, however, specifically excluded any resolution of Hans Island. This is a very small, uninhabited island, just half a square mile in area, located in the Kennedy Channel of the Nares Strait between the northwest coast of Greenland and the Canadian Ellesmere Island. For more on the history and settlement of Greenland, check out our video on the subject from last year, which also touches on the history of American involvement in the region. Both Canada and Greenland have historical claims on Hans Island, hence why it was left out of the 1973 treaty. In 1984, after 3 years of petroleum exploration in the area, a small contingent of Canadian soldiers somewhat jokingly put up a Canadian flag on the island, along with a bottle of Canadian whiskey. Denmark sent a small contingent to the island, and its minister for Greenland raised the Danish flag, and in jest he left a bottle of cognac at the site for the Canadians to find. This became a humorous and somewhat playful dispute known as the Whiskey War, in which every few years, one side or the other would raise their flag while leaving behind a bottle of hard liquor. Again, most of this was done in good fun, and both countries are military allies as part of the NATO alliance. The Canadians eventually left an Inuit stone figure on the island, and in the early 2000s began to more seriously assert their claim of sovereignty. After Denmark lodged protest, the Canadians backed down, and since then efforts have been ongoing to arbitrate and ultimately end the dispute. In 2018, the two governments established a joint task force to come up with a permanent resolution for the issue. This included looping in the local Inuit populations in a consultative role. On June 14, 2022, the final settlement of the issue was agreed upon, with the signing of a border agreement. This agreement divided the island along a natural seam in its rocky surface, with the eastern 60% going to Danish Greenland and the western 40% going to Canada. The agreement still needs to be ratified by all interested parties, those being Canada and Denmark, along with the territories involved, Nunavut and Greenland. Thus, the agreement has not yet officially taken effect, so for now the island remains not under the control of either faction. Over in Mali, Islamist groups, including the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and others, saw reverses in their ongoing campaigns in the Sahel. Much of the land that changed hands, however, went to the state of Azawad, the Tuareg breakaway state, as the Malian government itself remains rocked by instability following a pair of military coups in 2020 and 21, and France's decision to limit the scope of its operations in the country. As of yet, new civilian elections still have not been staged. A similar situation persists in Chad, following the conclusion of internal skirmishes in its northern areas. Even though these concluded last year, a military council or junta remains in place, although in this case the junta's leadership is the same as the civilian political leadership in the country for the past 30 years, so even a restoration of civilian rule would likely be a change of form, not substance. In Yemen, the nearly decade-old civil war, which has been labeled by the United Nations as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, conflict appears to finally be drawing down in some form or fashion. Two major developments took place in April, both connected to an apparent desire by external actors to extract themselves from the war, chiefly Saudi Arabia. The Saudi-backed government of the Yemeni Republic, which is the faction recognized by most governments around the world, was led for a decade by Abdurrahman Mansur Hadi, during which the faction steadily lost influence and territory, being relegated by April 2022 to mostly coastal fortifications, border posts, and desert installations. With Saudi Arabian prodding, on the 7th of April, Hadi transferred power to a Presidential Leadership Council, which would serve as the collective head of state for the Republic of Yemen faction in upcoming negotiations. This council does include representatives from the South Yemen Movement government and the Southern Transitional Council. However, the United Arab Emirates retains their backing of that faction, and thus its ultimate reintegration into the Saudi-backed Republic of Yemen remains unclear. Even within the South Yemen Movement government, although the Southern Transitional Council holds the most sway due to its militia, which is supported by the United Arab Emirates and helped the South Yemen Movement government come to power in the first place, there are other South Yemeni factions who don't necessarily see eye to eye on every issue with the STC. In any case, the inclusion of Southern representatives within the new Presidential Council of the Republic of Yemen does potentially chart a course for reconciliation between them, and it also indicates that they could present a united front in negotiations with the Iranian-backed Houthis in the northwest. The reason that all three factions are jockeying for position at the negotiating table mainly stems from the stalemate in the Battle of Marib. This battle had been raging over numerous months, the last phase of which saw the Houthis attempting to capture the city, but being denied by some of the strongest remaining military forces of the Yemeni Republic. With Saudi Arabia looking for a way out of the war, this presented the perfect opportunity for negotiations while the Houthis are at a weak point and may be more willing to sit down. This proved prudent when, on April 2nd, the Yemeni Republic and the Supreme Political Council of Yemen agreed on a ceasefire, which has held for 3 months since then. In any case, negotiations between the highly entrenched factions and the eventual stitching of the country back together are likely to be extremely contentious and difficult. Thus, for the time being, it seems that Yemen will likely be in a similar position to Syria, no longer in the midst of war, but effectively partitioned pending a final agreement. In Ethiopia, the civil war has effectively ended, with the Abiy Ahmed-led federal government emerging victorious. However, although federal forces have taken some areas of western Tigray, the TPLF, running Tigray as a one-party socialist state, remains in control of Mekelle and the rest of the Tigray region until some sort of formal peace. However, the situation is complicated by the fact that the Ethiopian federal government has designated the TPLF as a terrorist organization, and thus it seemingly cannot accept an outcome where the TPLF remains in control of the Tigray National Regional State, instead setting up their own transitional government of Tigray in the areas they've recaptured. As of this point, a peace process has not really even been initiated, so moving forward, this could simply become a frozen conflict. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian federal government has had success in pushing back Oromo rebels to the west. We've previously discussed the so-called New Pink Tide in Central and South America, and the continuous push and pull in these regions between politically socialist and classicalist forces. Lately, as the New Pink Tide implies, there have been a run of electoral successes by revolutionary or semi-revolutionary socialists. As we detailed, this has included several countries that have long been in the classicalist American camp, including Chile, which saw its classicalist constitution thrown out, and a new constitutional convention called by a government led by a coalition that includes the Communist Party. While this trend hasn't been universal, and the election of a classicalist moderate in El Salvador gave fodder for the idea that perhaps a new white tide was springing up in reaction, it appears that instead the pink to red trend has continued, this time in another longtime American ally, Colombia. The American and Colombian governments worked hand-in-hand successfully throughout the 1990s and 2000s to combat the rebel group FARC and the drug trade, both of which were relatively successful, especially the operations against FARC, which eventually was forced to reintegrate itself peacefully into the Colombian political system, a major victory of this partnership. However, on June 19, 2022, Gustavo Petro, a former socialist guerrilla fighter turned politician, was elected president. The former mayor of Bogota has been widely cited in media reports as Colombia's first ever far-left leader. However, while he's in the past praised Hugo Chavez, Petro has a contentious relationship with other leftist leaders in the region today. This does leave the door open for the possibility that Petro may have a more amiable relationship with the Americans than his leftist counterparts in the region. Along these lines, and also to deal with legislative opposition, Petro appointed a more center-left finance minister. However, as Petro has yet to take office, Colombia's future relationship with its neighbors and with America remains unclear, at least at this point. Meanwhile, in Burma, not much has changed on the front lines since our last update, with a government in exile having been formed by supporters of the former state councilor Aung San Suu Kyi back on April 16, 2021. However, they still don't have the ability to oppose the military junta directly, and thus their opposition to the regime in Naypyidaw is mainly represented through breakaway states, the Kachin Independence Organization, and the Karenni National Union, with the Karenni breakaway state providing the main avenue as support, as well as training for street protesters who fled from Yangon. We'll continue to follow these developments as the situation simmers. Now we'll go to Ukraine, where some very consequential battles are being fought. Russia, having failed to capture Kiev and having finally succeeded in crushing and then capturing Mariupol, is now attempting to close pincers around the heavily fortified Ukrainian cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. Severodonetsk, on the far side of the Donetsk River, was taken in recent days by the Russians after heavy fighting and after the city exchanged hands multiple times. Still, the Ukrainian positions in Lysychansk, although tenuous, are defended by river crossings on 3 sides and by heavy artillery in the south. Russia, though, does attempt to push into the rear of these positions by starting a move against Sloviansk to the west. Meanwhile, Russia has consolidated their control of captured territories, placing newly conquered lands in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts under the control of their Donetsk and Lugansk puppet states, while placing captured areas of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv oblasts under the control of combined civil-military administrations led by political collaborators. Russia and its proxies have been accused of widespread violence in the captured areas, as was the case during the fighting in 2014 and 15, and during the Kiev offensive earlier this year. We'll certainly continue to follow the progress of the Russian-Ukrainian war, along with all the rest of these conflicts. For the full update, make sure to check out the map at apoliticalworldmap.org. Make sure to like and comment on this video, subscribe to the channel, press the bell button, share this content with anybody who might be interested, and if you can, donate on Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.